At nearly 3,000 meters high, the Zugspitze is famous for its breathtaking panorama and some of the cleanest air in Germany. At the summit, the highest environmental research station in the country. It includes an observatory that monitors the Earth's atmosphere throughout the year, with a focus on potent greenhouse gases. For the complex analyses, physicist Ralf Sussman from the Karlsruhe Institute of Technology captures sunlight and directs it into the interior of the mountain station with a system of gold-coated mirrors. So, what is the state of the Earth's delicate atmosphere? In the laboratory, a spectrometer separates the light and analyzes the individual wavelengths. With up to 140 measurements per day, the team gains extremely precise insight into the composition of the atmosphere.
So, Marcus, let's take a look at our current solar measurements.
For years, they've noted an increase in the concentration of greenhouse gases.
It turned out well today. This is the sunlight, and you can see these fingerprints.
Each gas produces typical lines in the solar spectrum. The deeper the blue gaps in the spectrum, the more gas was measured.
Exactly, this double line. If you zoom in there again, the two lines maybe.
He's very concerned about rising methane.
Methane is quite a critical global warmer. On the one hand, you might think it's harmless, because it disappears from the atmosphere within 10 years. Quite the opposite of carbon dioxide, which lingers for thousands of years. So you might think it's harmless. On the other hand, in those 10 years that methane is in the atmosphere, its contribution to the greenhouse effect is at least 100 times that of carbon dioxide.
After CO2, methane is the most important human-caused greenhouse gas and accounts for about a quarter of global warming to date. So where exactly does the colorless, odorless gas come from? There are some natural sources. In wetlands, methane escapes as organic matter decomposes, and it's also released in forest fires. But the massive increase in methane emissions since the beginning of the industrial era is due to humans. Large quantities are emitted in intensive livestock farming and in the extraction and use of fossil fuels. Methane is the main component of natural gas. Human activity has more than doubled the concentration of methane in the atmosphere. How much of this is due to fossil fuels? And what could be causing the extremely accelerated increase that researchers have been observing in the last 15 years? A decisive clue for Ralf Sussman lies in measuring another gas, ethane.
Ethane is the second most abundant component of natural gas after methane. But in agriculture, in cattle farming, there's no ethane at all. So the fact that there's a sharp rise in methane in 2007, while at the same time there's also a sudden increase in ethane, is very telling. And we can actually then calculate that 40% of this upswing, of this entire increase in atmospheric concentration from 2007 till today, is caused by oil and gas production.
International studies confirm there are more than 80 million tons of methane entering the atmosphere as natural gas every year. How can it be? We launched an elaborate investigation in search of the source of these climate-impacting emissions. Natural gas, the allegedly clean fuel, is used to heat about a third of Europe's homes, offices, and stores. To feed the demand, an underground network of gas pipelines crisscrosses our cities. Is natural gas escaping from this distribution system unnoticed? Thomas Rookman of the Dutch University of Utrecht is trying to find out. Measurements taken by his American colleagues have inspired the climate scientists to search for evidence in Europe. His van is equipped with technology that continuously monitors the surrounding air for traces of methane. The two researchers drive through the streets of Utrecht, constantly on the lookout for unusually high concentrations of methane. It's not long before the alert goes off.
Oh yes, nice. There it is. Good.
The reading shows a sudden jump in methane levels. Is there a natural gas leak nearby? Now they have to follow the trail on foot. Where exactly is the colorless and odorless gas coming from? With their mobile detector, they slowly work their way to the source. The potent greenhouse gas is seeping out through cracks in the pavement.
Yep, 5 ppm.
Since ethane and methane levels are measured simultaneously, they can immediately distinguish natural gas from other methane sources such as wastewater. Right at the drain, the concentration is almost high enough to present an explosion risk.
This is a big one here, right?
It's a clear case. Natural gas is seeping out.
We
find this regularly. On practically every outing, we find a handful of leaks. We'll now report that to the gas network operator, inform them that there's probably a gas leak here, and they can actually dig a hole and find out exactly where the leak is. We can't see that from the surface, of course. We can only see the point where it's entering the atmosphere.
This time, Thomas Rookman finds further leaks in several other streets. None, however, large enough to pose a risk to residents. The local gas supplier is unaware of all these leaks, although they themselves check the pipes.
The
gas suppliers monitor the streets at different intervals. It depends on what kind of pipeline materials they've used. It's generally annual checks, but can also be every 3 or 5 years. It means if a leak like that occurs and isn't found quickly, it can be there for months or years before it's actually repaired and the emissions are stopped.
But then in other cities it can be...
Rookman and several researchers from other universities have been tracking down methane leaks across Europe, in 11 cities to date.
But then in the cities...
The conclusion? Everywhere, precious natural gas is escaping the grid. This could be largely prevented if gas suppliers carried out more frequent and thorough monitoring.
By 50%.
But their investigations also clearly show that the municipal gas networks are probably only responsible for a small percentage of the 80 million tons of methane that escape in the form of natural gas. So where is the rest coming from? In Paris, we visit a company that specializes in global energy and environmental analysis. The startup Kairos was founded to advise companies and investors in the oil and gas sector. One of the founders, Antoine Haff, was formerly chief analyst at the International Energy Agency. At Kairos, he provides his clients with high-quality data on the extraction, trade, and consumption of oil and gas. But some of his clients began asking if and where methane was escaping in the process. His team of data analysts set out to investigate, using publicly available information. The European environmental satellite Sentinel-5P has been orbiting the Earth since October 2017. The instruments on board measure pollutants such as ozone and formaldehyde, as well as methane. Once a day, this produces a map of methane concentrations across the globe. But this measures the total methane released over the years from natural sources and man-made sources such as agriculture and industry. Can the methane currently entering the atmosphere as natural gas be tracked down in this mountain of data?
It entails a huge amount of processing of artificial intelligence modeling. You need to understand methane, you need to understand the oil industry, you need to understand how the weather and wind patterns affect the dispersion of methane. So we combine all these inputs to develop algorithms that process the raw data.
Data specialists in Paris have recently succeeded in what was previously impossible. They've used computer programs to identify specific locations where natural gas methane is being released. These are found worldwide, precisely where major production sites of natural gas and oil are located.
Methane is a problem, it's a negative, and for a long time there's been a kind of a defensive attitude towards methane. No, I'm not emitting methane. No, those measurements cannot be right. I'm clean, I'm good. And transparency is still lacking for many producers, including some of the majors.
Does this also apply to companies in Germany? We tried to gain access to one of the approximately 1,100 production facilities in the country. After a rejection by oil giant Exxon, we negotiated with Germany's largest oil and gas company, Wintershall. Finally, we obtained permission to visit a gas production facility east of Bremen. Are large quantities of methane escaping here unnoticed? Wintershall has recently begun to address this question. It's voluntarily committed to inspecting its facilities for leaks once a year, which it did in Germany for the first time at the end of 2021. Sensitive gas cameras are used to detect potential trouble spots. Using a gas cylinder, technician Marcel van de Kolwijk demonstrates how the camera works. The optical gas detection is based on the fact that gases absorb atmospheric radiation and become visible with infrared. With conventional video technology, the gas is invisible. Only in infrared mode does it show up as a black cloud. The technicians systematically search the plant for leaks. Hundreds of valves, connections, and pipelines have to be checked. In addition to the gas camera, a high-precision sniffing meter searches for the smallest leaks. The company says that a handful of minor leaks are usually detected during the 2-day inspection of such a plant. The gas camera doesn't register anything during our visit. Such images might not have been appreciated by the company.
In der Tat versuchen die Unternehmen, die Emissionen zu verringern.
The companies are in fact trying to reduce emissions, but you don't have to believe everything they say.
Deswegen ist auch wichtig,
And that's why it's important to carry out independent measurements and establish techniques that are properly tested, so the companies can really deliver credible data.
Die Unternehmen wirklich auch
The bottom line is we're still seeing an increase in methane, and in the last year, more than ever before.
im letzten Jahr sogar stärker, als wir es bisher überhaupt gesehen haben.
So where do the millions of tons of natural gas detected in the atmosphere come from? Not from Germany, according to independent measurements. This is plausible. Less than 0.1% of global oil and gas extraction takes place here. Europe as a whole contributes only about 5% of global production. So it follows that Europe's share of global methane emissions from oil and gas would be relatively small. The major oil and gas reservoirs are found in Russia and other states of the former Soviet Union, and in the Middle East, with major producers in the Persian Gulf. In the past 15 years, production has increased significantly, especially in North America. Around a quarter of the world's oil and natural gas is now produced here. Much of it in the so-called Permian Basin in southwestern U.S. This border region between the states of Texas and New Mexico is one of the global centers of this billion-dollar industry. About 40% of U.S. oil is produced here, and natural gas production in the region has increased by 350% since 2011. New production records were announced in the first half of 2022. There are over 100,000 wells in the Permian Basin, rig upon rig, as far as the eye can see. How much natural gas, along with methane, escapes during production? A research site at Colorado State University is dedicated to answering this question.
So you're thinking over here, maybe...
For over a decade, engineer Daniel Zimmerly has been refining methods for detecting methane leaks in the industry.
I think we'll be good. Yes. So, and one over there.
To this end, he's created a unique testing facility. What at first glance looks like a typical oil and gas extraction facility is just a deceptively real facade. The natural gas does not come out of the ground here, but is delivered by truck. It can be distributed throughout the site via hidden pipelines and released in a targeted manner. This allows researchers to test measuring devices and to train technicians in detecting leaks in oil and gas production.
Look at this, at the vertical pipe, there's a little valve sticking off horizontally on it.
They now know much more about the typical weak points in such a system.
Here.
Probably the big thing that's changed in the last 5 years is when we talked about fugitive emissions 5 years ago, people were interested in kind of small things like, this joint or this piece of equipment. And that was where the focus was. And what we've learned in the last 5-6 years is that the big problem is things we weren't even looking at 5 years ago, where you end up with large emitters because some valve failed or some process failed and you have a very large plume.
You're talking about the companies that run those sites.
And the regulators. The companies that run the sites, the regulators that were constructing the programs. I would say even the NGOs that were kind of looking at emissions didn't really quite understand the frequency and the size.
Large amounts of gas pouring unnoticed into the environment. Does this explain the huge increase of methane in the atmosphere? We turn to the International Association of Oil and Gas Producers, whose Secretary General, Iman Hill, we meet in Houston for an interview.
We're here today to talk about methane, right? I mean, the oil and gas industry is big and it's international, right? So do you represent like all of it?
I can confidently say that we represent our industry, and we have members from every continent. Now, we concern ourselves with looking across our membership and their membership and being as global as possible to give our members the toolkits to be able to, as accurately as possible, define their baselines with respect to what their current methane emissions are, and then encourage them, and again providing actual hard deliverables in the form of a toolkit to allow them to start to put together methane emissions reduction plans. And fundamentally, nobody in this sector doesn't believe, there's not one single member company that I know of that doesn't believe that this is a top priority for them, and it's top of the agenda for the work that they're doing.
It sounds exemplary, but none of the companies we contact in the U.S. are willing to show us their production facilities. We receive one rejection after another.
We respectfully decline participating in the production. Unfortunately, we cannot accommodate your request at this time. At this time, we are not able to accommodate this request.
Can large methane emissions really remain unnoticed? We contact independent researchers, the scientists at the Environmental Defense Fund, EDF, a non-governmental environmental organization. Equipped with a special camera, this helicopter will be searching today for methane emissions here in southwestern U.S. And all findings will be systematically documented by EDF expert David Lyon. The helicopter is also frequently used by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. EDF has rented it for its research, with funding from foundation grants and donations. Today, the environmentalists will be getting an impression of the site and be able to view the methane leaks in person. The helicopter is scheduled to fly over 60 production sites today, in a sequence chosen in consultation with the scientists. The crew focuses on a facility where both gas and oil are being extracted. The gas camera can detect methane with infrared. Bingo. A continuous stream of methane is pouring from the emergency vent of one of the tanks. The helicopter crew reports the find to the ground station. Now, the EDF researchers set off. Fortunately, they're able to get relatively close to the site. Often, boreholes can only be reached by private roads and are closed off to the public. This production well, like the vast majority here, is unmanned. Nonetheless, EDF researchers keep a safe distance from the rig so as not to illegally enter the site. Even from this distance, the special camera should be able to detect the venting gas. The diagnosis is easy.
So at this site, we are seeing constant emissions coming from these valves at the top of the tank. So I think what was happening at this site is this equipment over here is the separator, and it separates the oil and gas. And if it's working normally, it will have the oil go to the tanks and the gas go to the pipeline so it can be sold to customers. But what we think's happened is the separator had a stuck valve, so the gas, instead of going to the pipelines, was going to the tank and then outside to the atmosphere. So not only is this causing methane emissions, but the company is losing product. So it's really important for the companies to fix the equipment, in this case the separator. They would stop the emissions and they'd sell more natural gas.
And this discovery would not be the last of the day. Over and again, the crew finds faulty valves and leaks in tanks. And a defective flare where excess natural gas is incompletely burned.
Yeah, it's a very common problem. So the two biggest issues we see are abnormal emissions coming out of the tanks and then unlit flares. So in the Permian, we're using multiple kinds of measurements at different scales, from measuring the total emissions in the Permian Basin to measuring emissions at individual sites.
The Environmental Defense Fund is taking on what should be the government's job. For 2 years, researchers have been collecting data in Texas and Mexico. Larger areas were scanned by plane. Scientists from the University of Wyoming were tasked with documenting emissions from individual production sites and central gas processing plants. The helicopter has been deployed over and over again on methane detecting missions for EDF. Unlit flares are a major source of methane emissions. Flares are used for burning excess gas from oil production, which is often a cheaper solution than building transport pipelines for the gas. But extinguished or defective flares release the potent greenhouse gas directly into the atmosphere. And numerous such incidents were detected by researchers. The evidence that EDF and its partners have gathered is overwhelming and extremely inconvenient for the industry. 10 to 15 times more methane is apparently being released in southwestern U.S. than the companies claim. The EDF continually updates its findings online, while also notifying the relevant operators. Their reactions vary.
Many of the operators now are trying to figure out what is exactly causing these emissions and then figuring out how they can stop the recurrence. But there still are a lot of companies who are not using measurements and really need to start figuring out where their emissions are coming from so they can start reducing their emissions.
David Zimmerly of Colorado State University has had similar experiences.
What about the fat tail? What about those heavy emissions? What can be done about those?
Well, so for the large emitters, you got two things. One of them is recognition that they even exist, okay? So the aircraft overflights you're seeing in mini basins, even satellite work you're seeing now, is highlighting that they exist. 5 years ago, people just, they didn't believe they existed, okay? So awareness is job one, okay?
We talked to Dan Zimmerle of CSU at METAC, and he told me that the operators are very often surprised how much stuff there is, especially when it comes to the heavy tail, to the super emitter stuff. That sounds like your member companies might not know a lot of their emissions.
I would disagree with you on that, actually. I really would. And I can't speak for Dan, and I can't speak for the work that he's doing. All I can speak to really is knowing the internals and the way that our member companies operate.
It seems that many companies in the oil and gas industry are still in denial, but the new revelations are putting them under pressure. At French data analysis company Kairos, the specialists have refined their methods. Now they can even identify individual companies and plants from the raw data delivered daily by environmental satellites. The yellow stripes are kilometer-long methane plumes. Several tons of methane gas are blown into the atmosphere every hour by one single facility. And analysts are detecting such super emitters all over the world, in practically all major oil and gas production regions.
This is huge. We thought at the start of our work that we would pick up maybe a dozen such events every year. We sometimes pick up a dozen a day. We always pick up more than a dozen a week. So those events are very, very frequent. They're intermittent. They don't last for a very long time. But in a few hours, a super emitter can emit as much carbon equivalent as tens of thousands of cars for an entire year.
In southwestern U.S. in early 2022, emissions rose by a full third. Analysts are also finding super emitters in the Middle East and in Russia. These revelations have been met with resistance from the industry.
Initially, when satellites started revealing levels of emissions that were significantly above what the companies were reporting, there was a little bit of disbelief, discomfort, and pushback. We're now beyond that point. We're now at the stage of coming up to terms with a stark reality, which is a problem, a challenge, because it casts a negative light on industry. But it's also an opportunity because so much can be done quickly, can be done cheaply, and can be done in a way that can be communicated in a way that can be trusted.
Technical solutions already exist, as seen at Colorado State University. Daniel Zimmerle and his colleagues there show us measurement technology that can detect methane emissions cheaply and quickly. Several different manufacturers are currently having their sensors and cameras tested on campus. The goal is to have production facilities and pipelines comprehensively monitored around the clock, in contrast to standard practice. To make the test as realistic as possible, the researchers are running a secret test protocol.
Is that one not trending at all?
Over several days, they repeatedly release different amounts of methane gas at different locations.
They don't measure zero very well, right?
That's the normal lower range.
That's sort of just the floating.
But the operators of the monitoring devices don't know when, where, or how much. The technology must be capable of alerting the facility operator at once, so they can stop the methane leak. It works. The camera registers methane. Problem solved?
I'm in the business of leak detection and repair, so I should be the grand champion of leak detection, right? But in reality, leak detection is probably the worst way to mitigate emissions, right? Okay, it's the equivalent of looking for the horses after they already have run out of the barn, right? So what you really want to be doing is using the information from your leak detection to improving your process. So the way to mitigate emissions is to start with controls on your site, the design of your site, to make the emissions less probable. And then you come in at the end with leak detection to find out when that control didn't work.
In Germany, such continuous monitoring methods aren't yet in use. Oil and gas companies have so far concentrated on looking for small leaks once a year. As a result, they too may be overlooking emissions of methane.
There's still a gap between actual emissions and the emissions we're reporting. And we're working now to fill the gap. In this regard, more emission sources have been defined, some sources that we hadn't even been aware of. But of course, we're working on the gap, and it's why these initiatives exist. We understand, and we want to improve.
In Berlin, a non-profit organization is closely monitoring the activities of the industry. Environmental Action Germany has been calling for some time for more consistent action against methane emissions from the oil and gas industry. We ask its executive director, Sascha Müller-Krainer, what he thinks of the company's efforts.
It's good that there's now a voluntary initiative on the part of the industry saying we want to assess the problem. But in addition to voluntary commitments, we also need legal regulations, of course, because ultimately it's about taking action that costs money. And when push comes to shove, it's non-binding, voluntary, and the costly methane reduction measures won't be taken. That's why we need clear-cut legislation here.
The organization has criticized the fact that companies in Germany are not even obliged to measure their methane emissions. The EU is working on a uniform methane strategy, but this has been the subject of behind-the-scenes wrangling for years. The draft resolution requires companies to measure their emissions and stipulates that no more natural gas may be deliberately discharged. This is still common practice in many countries during maintenance work. But there's another way to handle that. Here, the long-distance network operator OGE is building a new compressor station on an active gas pipeline, which is full of natural gas. The nearest location where the pipe can be shut off is 17 kilometers away. In order to open the pipeline safely, the natural gas, more than 500 tons of it, must be removed from this section.
In this 17-kilometre section of pipeline, which has been shut down and is now being evacuated, pumped empty of natural gas, you could supply 530 single-family homes with gas for a year. And in the past, about 10 to 15 years ago, you would have basically ended up releasing that gas into the atmosphere.
In places where that's still common, Russia, for example, a super emitter then shows up in the methane satellite imagery. By investing in such trucks, OGE has greatly reduced venting in its own operations. The mobile compressors use high pressure to transfer the natural gas between pipeline sections. The gas is no longer lost. Controlling emissions doesn't only make economical sense.
The EU methane initiative contains a number of useful things. For the first time, methane emissions in the EU are to be recorded and reported in a standardized form and also to be verified. But there are very important things missing. Most importantly, that most natural gas is not produced in the EU, but is imported. And most methane emissions don't occur within the EU at all, but in the producing countries.
The European Union can only cover a small part of its natural gas needs through its own production. The big suppliers are Norway and Russia, who before the Ukraine war supplied about 40% of Europe's gas needs. But no matter where Germany and the EU have imported their gas from, to date, they've had little or no influence on the suppliers' methane emissions. Yet the fact remains, high standards for clean production are imperative if we wish to combat global warming.
The EU would basically have to introduce mandatory labelling for natural gas being imported into the EU. And you'd have to check closely. Are operations transparent? How much methane escapes during production? What's the climate compatibility? With all our focus on securing our energy needs, we can't afford to lose sight of our climate targets. Sometimes I have the feeling that the climate gets forgotten.
The sobering conclusion of our research: more than 80 million tons of methane continue to escape into the atmosphere as natural gas, year after year. All of it preventable. The gas causes further global warming, and at the same time is lost as a valuable energy source.
You feel powerless when you think that what's needed is the restructuring of the entire industry and transport sectors, and it can't be done individually. It can only be tackled at the political level, and it would have to be globally coordinated, again politically, and you can't help noticing that joint action global politics is a bit restricted right now. So all that's left is to hope that at some point things will progress significantly. We don't have much time left.